here is the Israeli Minister of Public Diplomacy saying this in English. I think that's notable because of the audience that she's trying to speak to here. One of the many, many far-right extremist members of Benjamin Netanyahu's government, speaking about Palestinians. And right now, Israeli forces are killing Palestinians in record numbers to start a calendar year. And yet this is her characterization of Palestinians when they choose to react to that.
An Israeli mother stood above the grave of her 2 sons today. They were brutally murdered just because they were Jews. 12 other Israelis were slaughtered since January. 530 violent Palestinian attacks were reported last month alone. 530. Just imagine this impossible daily reality. Innocent men, women, children, and elderly people, just like sitting ducks. Don't be misled and don't be naive. It's not a war on territory. It's a fundamentalist religious war of brainwashed murderers who were programmed to seek Jewish blood since age 0. There are hypocrites who wake up to condemn violence here only when it suits their narrative of a so-called occupying apartheid country. I urge them to visit the mother who buried her 2 sons today and speak to her about symmetry.
I would love to speak about symmetry or the lack thereof from the country that has unlimited, unconditional financial and weapons support from the most powerful country in the world, who is killing way more Palestinians than the numbers that she lay out right there. And those comments preceded comments, I think a day later or a few days later, from the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. I hope I'm not butchering. Well, I don't give a shit. Who said that a Palestinian village needs to be erased, wiped off
the map, right?
Wiped off the map. I mean,
yeah.
The amount we talk about projection from conservatives in the United States. Listen to that projection, because that's what Israel is doing in Palestine.
Yeah, and they like Smotrich and those types of folks, when a settler gets killed in violence, they love it because it's basically a propaganda object for them to continue like state violence.
Well, and also she said it right there. Like there is an asymmetry, and it's not just in terms of violence, but it's in terms of expectation. And the expectation is that because of the inherent qualities which she laid out, being murderous savages that are present in, Palestinians and Muslims, like this narrative exists all across the Western world, then they require the brutality of this apartheid regime just by nature of what it means to have social order. If they weren't under this brutality, they would be killing more of our grandmothers, is the argument she's making. And any brutality aimed at them is unjustified because they don't require that kind of terror, because they're just innocent and trying to live their lives. And it's a fundamental aspect of how we organize Western society, whether we're talking about domestic terrorist regimes or international regimes of colonialism, is that like some people are deserving of living under a regime of terror, and when other populations are subjected to it, we just call it terrorism. And that's what's necessary to maintain the social order. And, I think it's clear to anyone who is paying attention what's going on in Israel. It's clear that the international community is largely complicit, and that, one day, who knows how we're going to get there. Like, we're going to be talking about Israel the same way we talk about South Africa, at least people who talk about South Africa. And, as we talk about it in the past, hopefully that the apartheid regime has been dismantled, will, hopefully we won't be hand waving. I won't be hand waving the complicity of the international actors who just sat there and going, I don't know. There's violence on both sides. Israelis say that Palestinians are brutal savages. Palestinians say, please stop killing us. Who are we supposed to believe? I don't like it's.
Yeah, like the main difference is like in South Africa, there's a more explicit sort of like white man's burden colonial thing, but it's the exact same dynamic with regards to the demographic control.
There's an element of the sort of white man's burden of this Israeli situation. And it's founded in our, the American narrative that like they're the only democracy, quote unquote, in the Middle East, and they're necessary as our ally in the area to maintain like control over like the bad Muslims. Now, the fact that we also fund the Saudis and a lot of other like brutal Muslim regimes is erased. But, we understand how people view Israel culturally in America who aren't familiar with it. And we understand that it's viewed as sort of this bastion of democracy because it's largely racialized as being white or non-Arab, at least in a largely Arab Middle East.
Well, it is the colonial conception of Zionism that was like foundational, at least from the British standpoint, in the creation of Israel, and that's what this is an extension of. It's a settler colonialist effort, and I mentioned that the members of Benjamin Netanyahu's government are far right, just because I think it's helpful for somebody coming into this topic to have that connection be drawn. But the entire conception of a settler colonial state is right-wing in and of itself. So the structure of the government, as long as it continues to occupy Palestinians' land that was rightfully drawn for them in terms of international boundaries for decades, and Israel's just continued to violate that. As long as that is a fundamental piece of a government, there's no government that can exist in Israel that is not right-wing. There's also no government that can exist as a democracy in Israel, because Palestinians, millions, hundreds of thousands, whatever figure you want to draw, are not included in the democratic process. And so this is the natural conclusion. This is the path that you go down when you are a society that separates and subjugates an entire population. So it's not a shock that this is the government and the only options that are provided within Israel, because that is it's foundational to apartheid, settler colonialism, whatever you want to call it. And like the United States, I know Ned Price spoke out against the comments from the finance minister. Cool. Can we have a conversation outside of Bernie Sanders making a case on Face the Nation one time about conditional aid? Or are we going to continue to go down this road and have this unconditional aid be looked at historically, as you guys say, in the same breath as apartheid in South Africa?
Well, I want to bring up South Africa. This is from a documentary from the 70s, interviewing some Afrikaners, and basically hear their justification about, we can't just do a simple one-state democracy, and we need to do apartheid. I'll play this, Bradley.
Making them strangers in their own country.
You cannot bring together, which is so totally different. The Afrikaner is of European stock, our traditions are European, but we evolved a different set of traditions to suit our being an African people now. And we differ from the English in small respects, but we differ very greatly from the other peoples who inhabit this country.
Yes, I think that each man has been given his piece of country and the
Go
right
back a
to
little
vote
bit.
in
This
his
is
country.
the woman I want to hear here.
But we differ very greatly from the other peoples who inhabit this country.
Yes, I think that each man has been given his piece of country and the right to vote in his country, and that is fair. Because if you have to put, if we have to say one man, one vote in South Africa and just leave it open, then the white is not going to get a fair share, because he has contributed economically to making this country what it is today. And if you say tomorrow, one man, one vote, then he doesn't, there is no chance for him. So it's better that each person be given the chance to have his piece of country and decide how he wants to live and what he wants to do with his country there.
There you go. Apartheid there. Everyone gets their own separate piece of separate countries.
Yeah, right. One person, one vote would be a little too dangerous.
I think Mia Goth made a really powerful point, a really powerful point there. I didn't follow a lot of it, but the parallels between the narrative of what's going on in Israel and what's happened in South Africa is even, it's stark there too, because, the narrative of why we can't have unconditional aid is because they're under constant threat from their brutal Muslim extremist neighbors. And the moment they are not given, constant aid, not just the Palestinians, but the other Middle Eastern countries are going to invade and like take back that land. And that becomes like a lot of our politics becomes mixed inextricably in. And also we need to be engaging in a brutal apartheid regime. And so it becomes like, well, if you question whether or not we can engage in a brutal apartheid regime, you're questioning whether or not Israel is allowed to exist. And that's a very like powerful direct sort of mutually inclusive relationship they've been able to craft in people's minds, where it's like you can't question what we're doing to Palestine unless you're going to question what Israel does and there's right to exist, because we can't exist without this. And I think that's just fucked up. You can't exist without doing a brutal apartheid regime. That's a little messed up.
But that's the uncomfortable reality of it, Brandon, right? I mean, like, to say it like that, that's considered outside of the realm of acceptable discourse, particularly in Washington. But it's that there's no way for Israel as currently constructed to exist without subjugating Palestinians as they see it. That's why, like, when people are like, do you support a two-state solution or one state? It's like, I support democracy, motherfucker. I want Palestinians to have an equal say in the land that they occupy and that in their ancestral home.
Let's start with stop brutally executing journalists there, and let's move up to voting. I know like we'd love to get it all done at once, and I'm not being pedantic, but they're trying to make it seem like people are asking for like that's what the South African Mia Goth was saying, like, first they get the right to vote and next they're in charge. And this here, like, we're at the stage where it's like, can you stop slaughtering journalists who are just there to cover things? Can you stop blowing up like journalist buildings, and can you stop doing like war crimes? And they're like, well, we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is why, like, this whole anti-woke thing and the IDW, and how there was never an IDW member critical of Israel, like, it's the exact same thing, right? Like, if you criticize, say, that the country's founded by plantation masters and their hypocrisy, then you hate America. Or if you, like, criticize, like, even have, like, a nuanced view of Abraham Lincoln's contributions to, say, dispossessing Native Americans of their land, then you hate America, as opposed to just have like an adult understanding of your fucking place in the world.
And it exists. Israel's not going anywhere anytime soon. There is no existential threat to Israel. Like, it is backed up by the most powerful country in the world. They're shoring up their relationships with countries like the UAE and with Saudi Arabia, and they're normalizing that, and it's all a part of like a proxy part of United States Western influence in that region, which we've already fucked up beyond humanity and killed millions and millions of people. And so we now have Israel as a part of our extended sphere of influence. That's the threat that the United States feels. They want that to continue. And they don't, as of now, really care about the cultural genocidal implications in the occupation. And it's just like incredibly frustrating to continue to have this conversation and know that the party that is in power right now in charge of the executive branch doesn't care. And in fact is complicit in like the smearing of people like Ilhan Omar, who call attention to the atrocities committed against the Palestinian people. And like there's just very, very little recourse. And
I mean, with South Africa, I mean, it's funny to contrast, like, or depressing to contrast what's happening with Labour Party and the expulsion of Corbyn with, like, Ronnie Kasrils, who Michael interviewed a number of times on this show, contributions to a book literally called The London Recruits, about that leftist and anti-apartheid struggle in that country. And it's like, there's no awareness of, like, let's maybe redo that for a modern, apartheid.
Yeah. Go ahead, Binder. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Emma, I see that you did not see that the State Department called on Netanyahu to disavow those comments.
Yes.
I saw that and I was thinking, like, okay, but what if he doesn't? What are you going to do about it? Like, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Exactly. What are you going to do about it?
I care about comments to a certain extent, but it's just, I mean,
Pull the money.
we are really high on our own fucking supply about funding the defense against Russia and Ukraine. At the same time as we have been for decades and decades funding the occupation, the brutal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Give me a break.